14th South Colonial Oaks Drive in Marion, Indiana. I'm speaking with Byron Tippey. Please state your name.
I'm Byron Tippey, born in 1922.
Do I have your permission to interview you?
Yes.
Do I have your permission to submit this interview to Marion High School?
Yes.
Do I have your permission to submit this interview to the Marion Public Library?
Yes.
First, tell me about yourself and where and when you were born and where you lived and your family.
I was born in Van Buren Township, but moved to Marion within the first few months of my life. Spent the first 5 years on North Boot Street, and then moved out east of Marion on Bradford Pike, about 2 miles. I later went to high school days in Jefferson Township, Huntington County, which was just on the Grant County line north. And then being in college, in Marion College for 3 years, then 3 years in the military, 1 year back at Marion College, and then 3 years I taught high school in southeastern Indiana, and I moved back to Marion in 1950. Now I assume we're talking about things that happened before 1950, so some of my very earliest memories, living on North Boot Street and being given strict orders not to go near the river, because the back of our lot did touch the river, and that was a particularly hazardous section of river. So my mother warned me about swimming, something that I never learned, certainly not there. Other things that I remember about Marion was that my grandfather owned a farm implement store, which at that time was located on Washington Street between 1st Street and 2nd Street on the east side of the street. He sold McCormick Deering farm implements and International Harvester farm equipment. I remember many times going there, in fact, once or twice a week at least, and we would see him work with the machinery, and my father worked there for my granddad. There were several times when the granddad would trade the farm implements for horses and horse-drawn equipment. Then when the Depression came along, it wiped him out because the farmers were unable to pay. And Granddad simply went out of business in 1933. Then it was necessary for us to move to a farm out north and east of Marion, just a short distance. But some of the things about early Marion while I was running up and down the streets as a small boy, I remember Saturday nights when it was so crowded on the sidewalks that you could hardly get from one place to the other. At least you didn't go rapidly. And there were several times that I would be there other than Saturday nights, but that was, the store stayed open late, so that accounted for that. Besides that, we would usually bring in eggs or cream, or both, from the little farm out east of town, and we would trade those for groceries. So the last thing on Saturday evening after Dad got done working at the store was that we would go past the grocery store, which was then on Branson and Sherman, the corner of Branson and Sherman, and we would do the trading as I suggested. I do remember sometimes that we would only have one candy bar, and there was my brother was 6 years younger than I, but by that time I'd be begging for, Mother asked me if I would share the candy bar a little bit with her, and of course my brother and I counted the crumbs on the halves of the candy bar. We were a little unwilling to share with her sometimes. Now, other things that happened during Depression days, we did usually have a cow, So I started milking a cow I was about 5 years old, I think. Probably not any more than 6. And I'd bring the milk in. So we usually had milk. We also had a garden. It wasn't a terribly productive garden, but at least it furnished us enough to eat. Green beans and fried eggs, cornmeal, cornbread, mush, those sorts of things we had. I can also remember that when we killed a chicken, my mother would skin the chicken legs and boil them in water, and that would make some kind of a soup. As of today, I don't know that it was very nutritious, but at least I've reached this age. Other things that I remember about Marion was standing outside of old Marion Hardware, which was at 5th in Washington, and listening to the World Series because they'd have a radio on outside the door, and we would get to hear the series that way. But you had to stand and no place to sit. I can remember other instances like Halloween time when I was probably only about 3 or 4 years old, and we were walking down the street going home from the store late on Saturday night, and my father and mother and myself, and I remember the boys slipping up behind and throwing a firecracker. I've never been more frightened than I don't think. I can remember that one pretty keenly. Now, as far as traveling about, the cars were quite old. My first car that I remember, let me say first, my father was a short time with a car agency, so he brought home a different car every 2 or 3 nights because he was a salesman. But as far as the one that we owned, probably a 1927 Chevy that would get up probably 40 miles an hour, a little better, not too much more than that. I do remember a few Model Ts around, but some of those were pretty old then. And I remember grandfather talking about it, so that may make my memory a little different than if he hadn't had one. Now, when we were out on this small farm, somebody else did the farming, and the grain was always cut with a binder, and the sheaves would be thrown on the ground, and then someone would come along and stack those up. And they needed to be stacked very well because my grandfather was very upset if any sheaf or any shock of sheaves fell over. You just didn't do that. You learned how to do it right. And as a little boy, I remember trying to lift up the sheaves and put them together like the big people did. But I couldn't even pick the sheaf up in some cases. Anyway, I learned later how to do it for sure. When it comes to other things that made me remember the Depression, I remember seeing a certain sweatshirt in Penny's store. It was red and black and gray and had certain leather white stripes down the back. I never wanted anything much worse in my life, but it was not obtainable. It was too much money. And I remember money business. In birthdays, I don't recall receiving gifts at all. My mother would usually say, "Now we're going to get your gift sometime as soon as we can." And those times very seldom, if ever, developed. So that I learned not to really expect much. And when it came to Christmas gifts, that was a little different because when my grandfather was doing real well in business, in fact, he had 2 Buicks, and so in that day and age, that really meant you were up there economically. But then the Depression hit, and he lost his business, and he was reduced to a beat-up old 1932 V8, which would scarcely go up and down the street. And I remember the brakes weren't too good in it, and I was with him one time when he applied into somebody from the back, and they were a little upset, wanting to know if he was a farmer, and he said, yep, he was. But depression may sound worse than it was, because I'm sure that my father and mother suffered a whole lot more than I did. They saw to it that I had enough to eat, so we weren't shorted all that much, but it wasn't very, we didn't have much variety, let's put it that way. We would dig dandelion greens in the spring, quite a while we'd eat those, and we'd have a lot of soup beans that we would grow during the summer and in the garden, and then dry them out and keep them for the winter. And I think I mentioned before, cornmeal was a real staple food in all ways. Now, as far as prices is concerned, memory does some queer things to you. But I do remember getting ice cream cones for a nickel, and later on they doubled the price to a dime. I also remember a little bit later, when I was high school age, going down to the local ice cream store where I met some of my friends, and they were working at Kroger's store, so they were making a little bit of money. And they had ordered sundaes, and I only had enough to, about a dime, to have an ice cream cone. And I was told by the clerk that I'd have to go up to the counter and take the ice cream outside because they didn't sit in the booths. That was a most embarrassing situation. As far as the first money that I can remember actually having for myself outside of a nickel or a dime here and there was when my father helped build the bridge on 13 and 18 out by Oak Hill School. And he spent one summer building that, so he came home and gave me a quarter one time. That's the first time I'd had money of my own to amount to much. I think I bought a jigsaw puzzle with that because I was told over and again I should spend it for something that really would last, would amount to something. So be that as it may, I don't know whether I'd make the same decision, but I think that's what it was at the time. Now, as far as clothes, when we went to school, everybody was dressed about the same. We had overalls, blue shirts, calico and gingham dresses for the girls. And if you got a tear in your overalls, especially in the knees, they'd be patched up and you went back to school. Now, I remember wearing good pants until I was in high school, which of course was about 1936. And even then, most of the time in high school, we wore overalls. All farm kids, all smelled alike. Didn't have to worry about deodorant very much. We didn't think anything about it. Through all the depression, we really didn't know we were poor. The government had to tell us that later. And I remember helping my father cut a tree down, which was out close to the house, a big maple. We cut it down on a very below zero night because we were that near out of fuel and we needed something to burn. Green maple didn't give much heat, but at least it must have kept us enough. And there were a lot of others. Hamburgers were only a dime, I remember. And then before very long, they got clear up to a quarter. And you could get a real good meal for 50 cents, about all you could eat. Generally, a quarter was enough. So that's about all we had. Now, as far as wages is concerned, For myself, my first jobs were helping plant tomatoes in fields. I'd ride the tomato planter, and you have a shelf of plants. You take one and put it down. Your partner puts one down. You put one down as you go along. I've noticed some, by the way, doing that even now, but very rare. Most of it's by seeding and so differently now. I forgot what I earned about it, to be honest, or earned from it, but it wasn't too much. My first pretty general job was mowing milkweeds out of fields of corn or out of fields of oats or soybeans. And the farmer just about a half mile east of where I lived had about 40 acres. So I would go and work 8 hours a day with a scythe mowing milkweeds, and he'd give me $1 a day and my dinner. And that was the first job. Then I graduated a little bit to help run a combine, one of those new things around after the binder. And I think maybe I made $1.25 a day at that time. And I later worked on a straw baling gang one summer for about 6 weeks. And I recall making $70 for those 6 weeks. And that was about the time I was ready to go to college. So I didn't have much saved up when I got in college. I actually went through college my first year on $90 cash and plenty of supplies from home. My roommate and I batched as for our meals, and I had scholarships academically, so about $90 bought my books and that kind of thing the first year. But that's unheard of today. Probably 2 books, or maybe 1 book cost you that much. Now, I suppose another topic, the segregation that happened, I really was not as aware of that as many were, because we didn't have that many different people in our school. We had a few dark-skinned people, but they, in many cases, were Italian-related, and we didn't notice too much of the difference. Okay. Now, I do remember my cousin who lived in Marion and was at a school where they were very heavily populated by blacks, telling several stories. And my family, as far as both my mother's family and my father's family, were rather naturally, well, let's say provincial. And I don't mean that to be all negative, but they were not terribly inclined to accept people of other color. My mother's family in particular, they had come from Amish, or rather Mennonite Brethren roots, and so they looked at things a little differently. My grandfather, who was in business, was much more apt to be friends to the blacks. In fact, after the Depression, toward the end of his life, he showed a lot of concern for them. But I'm just trying to set in motion what family feelings would be. When the hanging took place, I was 9 years old. I lived close enough to town until I could see the lights of town all up much brighter than usual, and I could hear some of the noise, but I was not allowed to go to town. And my father would not let me go to town the next day. And anyone that has seen the pictures and so on since knows why. To my knowledge, none of my people were involved in that. but we were not so perfect that we might not have been. So I'm sure that there are many families that feel that way today with the history of Marion. Now, as far as what has happened since, when I left Marion before 1950 to go down to teach in southeastern Indiana, it was a different culture because it was almost totally German back culture. In fact, they spoke German in the high school a half day until just a very little time before I started to teach down there. So I did get a new look at that culture, which of course made me think back about Marion and what it was like. But having lived in North Marion most of my life, and living in Marion itself, and then all the years since 1950 in South Marion, gives a little bit different perspective to some of it than had I lived in certain other areas. I also have had children in school from the Johnstown area and from the Possum Hollow area, and that would color my thinking about Marion, but that's after 1950 in Hastings. And let's see, all right, back when we did groceries, I mentioned getting them at the grocery store, and that was correct, until we moved on a farm a little farther northeast of town. Then we would trade two things. We had a fellow who brought bread around in a big old car that he had taken out the inside and made racks for bread. He'd bring bread around and trade loaves of bread for eggs. And there were times when a dozen eggs wouldn't buy a loaf of bread for you. But basically, that was a trade situation. The other items that we bought, the man, huckster, would come around, which was a traveling, we call it a van now, but a traveling vehicle was filled inside with shelves. I always like to see the huckster come because after Mother had bought a few items or traded for them, he would always give you a lollipop. You could count on that. That was one of the good things. Now, let's check him off. And see if there's anything we need else here. I'd rather
You mentioned a while ago that walking around Marion, the streets were real crowded. What was downtown Marion like, and what kind of entertainment did you have at the time?
Kind of what?
What kind of entertainment and movies?
Okay. As far as entertainment, there were movie houses, which I generally was not permitted to go, not only because of my parents' feelings about movies, but just absolutely didn't have the money to go. I can remember just a very few times that my grandfather, who was in business, would give my cousin and I money, and we'd go see the movie, whatever it was. But they were pretty few times, so I really didn't. Now the entertainment came to be, you walked around, looked in the stores, and as I said, you'd stand outside and listen to the World Series. And in the spring, of course, when the basketball tournaments were on, if you got fixed just right, you could get in the hardware store or something and get where a radio was on, and you'd have to either stand around the counters and that sort of thing. A lot of them did that. There was very, very little riding around because not that many cars. And so entertainment was more, for me personally, was much more in church groups and just playing with other people of your school and that sort of thing. We'd gather at one another's houses and play all kinds of games, and pen, mine, sheep, and hide and go seek, and variations of it, and all that sort of thing.
What was your first reaction when you heard that the United States had declared war?
In World War II?
Yeah.
Well, by that time, I was already at draft age, of course. And so I knew that my time would be very close. The doctor that delivered me as an infant was also the doctor that examined me out at the armory and had rather automatically put down 4F. The only difference about that, I knew enough about the Army to know that sooner or later they'd take me anyway. So the day after he did that, I went to Fort Wayne, and I had already had this set up. A man had come to campus at Marion College and said he wanted all that would sign up for enlisted reserves and stay in college. Well, we signed up all right, but some of us didn't stay in college very long. And I joined the Army in October 1942, and then was called to active service in March 43. So my first reaction, well, we have to back up a little bit, I guess, because this is after the first reaction. I was in the Marion College choir, and we had a concert out south and west of Marion when we heard the news that the war had been declared. And that was, well, it was something that just, you don't understand when it first happens near as much as you do after you've been there, naturally. It's just hard to fathom, hard to understand what is going on, except you know that you're going to be a bunch of you have to go. And we did, of course. Actually, when I heard Hitler's invasion of Poland, I was at a high school party. There were about 2 classes of us that had gotten together of a summer evening. Well, it was September the 1st, of course, 1939. So that was ahead of our declaration of war, of course. But we heard of Pearl Harbor when I was in the choir. And our concert that evening was about as sober as any concert's ever been. And then 2 weeks before that, Helen and I had been engaged, and thinking we had quite a long time before I'd have to go, but it didn't prove very long. So we were pretty well shook up. Anything?
What was it like in the war? Or did you have, how did it affect your family?
All right, and what I was involved in, well, my first 6 days after I was called to active service and went to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, I was on my way to the West Coast for Coast Artillery training. That was my first assignment. After that, I did get a chance to attend Stanford University and the University of San Francisco on an Army specialized training program. They were to teach us languages and or science, or engineering, I should say. Actually, I had French in college, and that's one reason I was on the list to go to Stanford. But when I got there, they were taking every other one to language and every other one to engineering. When they got to the fellow in front of me, they said language. They got to me, they said engineering. Well, I wasn't very much of an engineer, but at least I survived those two, and I appreciate the opportunities I had to see Stanford and quite a lot of San Francisco while I was out there. But that program folded up, and so some older generals and the Pentagon thought that mule pack was still the way to handle the mountains. And they were partly right. But they were training us with as a light division, they called it. We were down in a little bit Southern California, north of Los Angeles, where we trained in the mountains with mules. Well, eventually they saw that wasn't going to work. You couldn't carry enough firepower. And when you got where you're going, you only had a 3-inch gun. And that was hard. 3-inch artillery hardly knocked a hole in an outhouse. So they abandoned the mules as far as the fighting unit is concerned. And I've always said I could tell a little difference between the mules and the sergeants, because the sergeants had stripes on them. I get in trouble with that sometimes. I really, when I got in the Army, mules, they were taken to be pack-trained mules in Burma and Italy, and they were worth a great deal there. If a mule could not go up a trail, you best not try it. And they were really sure-footed. Well, they took us out of the mule pack, put us into a regular division, which was an infantry division, the 71st. And we were sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, and trained for a few months. And then Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, went on up to harbor, boarded the boat, and went to France in January 1945. Then we were committed to action on March the 11th, 1945, and were assigned to be one of the liberation divisions, which meant run, 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 fight, run, run, run. So we were on the road, and I had a Jeep, and I was sometimes I'd be driving there 24 hours in a row, but quite often in there. So it was quite an experience to run in at the end of the war to the concentration camps, where we took one camp, Dunkirk by name, and helped clean up a couple other camps. And then a few days later, I saw Dachau, but I had no part in taking that camp. But the unbelievable sights of concentration camp are still very vivid to me. I've written a paper on that for my grandchildren and this sort of thing, on the concentration camp. But eventually then of course, occupation came, and we spent a few months in occupation, and then I was shipped back to the United States in April of 1946. And 10 days after I got back, we were married. So she had waited over 3 years in engagement. And I appreciated her being true, that's for sure. Now what went on back here, I could sense that my folks did not always tell me all that was happening at home. They tried to. They talked about my pet cow, which I had raised from a calf, which was a purebred Guernsey, registered. And they wouldn't sell her, although I knew she was not a good milk producer, just fair. And I told them, go ahead and sell her, but because she wasn't profitable, they wouldn't do that until I got back. And I know that my dad by that time was farming rather heavily on a tenant farming basis. He never did own a farm of his own, but he did quite well in farming on a tenant farming basis. And we had done that for quite a while. My brother by that time was big enough to help him in the field, so he didn't miss me all that much, and I wasn't that heavy a worker. I could always go and stay with it all day, but it was difficult to keep up with all the heavy work that needed to be. I know that they had a difficult time with the the ration stamps that they had to get hold of in order to get sugar especially, and sometimes gasoline, and some foods. Then of course they grew some of their own, But between it all, they made it, and like a lot of others, and I still have in my possession some of the old food ration stamps that they used. As far as furloughs, I got home a couple times before going overseas. And once I got overseas, there wasn't anybody coming home till your outfit came. So we had to stick by. Now, as far as our reactions to war, overall, when we hear what's going on now, right currently, even though we aren't involved, and I don't know of an immediate member of my family, yet you really think deeply, because you know a little bit of what the guys are going through and what we may very likely be called on to go through, because those experiences don't leave you in memory, that is. So that much reaction anyway. Do I think they're doing the right thing? Well, I'm not sure, except that I do know that if we had put a stop to Hitler earlier, it wouldn't have cost what it finally did cost. Now, what the right time is that's open to debate. Anything else?
That's pretty good. Thanks a lot for the interview.
Well, you're welcome.
It's really interesting.